Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your daily sit rep for Friday, the 19th of December, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. A lot to get to today, and also over on the end of the show, we'll also cover the breakdown of the post-war, the post-1945 consensus, both internationally and nationally. And I'll take a look at what history says about what happens when that consensus breaks down. It tends to lead to conflict. There's a very strong correlation between a breakdown of consensus and conflict. Cover that at the very end of today's show. With that, Robert, good morning. Let's go ahead and jump inside the Beltway.
Good morning, Mike. So yesterday, the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation said it's going to build what it's calling a digital Silk Road to combat foreign adversaries. I think they mean China here on AI, critical minerals, and energy projects in Latin America. The DFC official Connor Coleman said that this is going to start at a much faster pace heading into next year, and they are also going to expand the countries that the the Development Finance Corporation will send money to, and this will include wealthy countries like Australia and Canada. I think this is a direct counter to China's Belt and Road Initiative that they've called the Digital Silk Road, and the choice of phrasing here is deliberate. There's also a huge expansion of the money that the DFC is going to have access to, from 60 billion to 205 billion starting next year. Also yesterday, the House Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the U.S. and Chinese Communist Party released a 10-point policy recommendation for Chinese deterrence over Taiwan. Some of the points they made that stuck out to me include strengthening joint military and economic planning with Indo-Pac partners, but also defending Taiwan's international space and global economic ties. I think this is hinting at something that the Trump administration may begin doing next year, which is pushing a lot of these other foreign countries to reverse their recognition from the PRC to Taiwan. The Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem said yesterday she's directing USCIS, or the Citizenship and Immigration Services, to immediately pause what's called the Diversity Lottery Immigrant Visa, or the DV1. This was after the shooter, the Brown University shooter, who also allegedly murdered a nuclear scientist from MIT, was found yesterday dead in a storage facility. And then moving over to the domestic side, the Department of Justice unsealed 70 indictments against Tren de Aragua members and leaders across 5 states, including Texas, Colorado, New Mexico, Nebraska, and New York. In these charges are included kidnapping, money laundering, robbery, and extortion. And in this announcement, they said they have indicted 260 Tren de Aragua members since the beginning of the year. And then finally, President Trump signed the National Defense Authorization Act of 2026 last night. And reading through the bill, this is going to significantly expand state and local authorities to counter drones. And specifically, it also directs the DOJ to stand up what it calls a national schoolhouse that these state, local, and tribal law enforcement officers are going to have to attend in order to conduct counter drone operations.
Robert, this is something that we discussed earlier this year, maybe even at the beginning of the year, about how the federal government, based off industry experts, wanted to push these counter drone capabilities down to lower levels, down to state and local law enforcement, because as of now, for anyone to use any kind of jamming device or electronic warfare device in these counter drone operations, they have to get approval from the federal government as it stands, correct?
Correct.
And so what does this look like here? Are we going to see drone jammers or something like that, some electronic warfare devices being pushed down to county sheriff's offices or to city police departments where there's a drone threat?
I think that's the intent, because the problem they're trying to fix that we covered, I think, at the beginning of the year, is that there are these jurisdictional loopholes that cartels and other illicit drone operators are taking advantage of to conduct surveillance and move stuff across the border, especially because there are military bases on the border. So the jurisdictional confusion basically means nobody does anything about it. I think the point of this is to fix that.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then last question here about this Tren de Aragua thing. So DOJ unsealed 70 indictments, but they have brought charges against how many members? 260?
So yes, since the beginning of the year.
Okay. Is there any indication? Can you put that into context? 260 out of how many potential TDA members are in the United States still?
I forget the number. I'll have to go back and find it. There was a congressional research service report from almost 10 years ago that I think said that it's in the low 10,000 members. I think they're much bigger than MS-13 even.
Wow. All right. So, I heard 260 TDA members have been arrested and charged, or rather indicted, since the beginning of the year, which 260 sounds like a lot. It doesn't sound like a lot when we're talking about maybe 10,000 total.
Well, and some of these indictments are against leadership that are currently outside the United States. One of them, who is the one I don't recall his name immediately, but he is one of these indictments, and he is apparently responsible for expanding the TDA within the entire Western Hemisphere, and he now has a $5 million bounty because he was operating out of Venezuela and at some point had come into the United States.
Okay. All right. Thanks for all that. Let's go ahead and move on over to the global sit rep, starting with a Venezuela update, Jared.
Yes. This is actually going to come out of the Federal Aviation Administration. They issued a notice to airmen warning that all altitudes around Venezuela are at risk due to the security situation. And this includes anybody taking off and landing from airports, as well as aircraft on the ground at airports. To me, this really looks like a get out now warning. Then just next door over in Colombia, the Colombian president had a press conference yesterday where he told the Venezuelan president Maduro that he cannot give orders to the Colombian army. And this came after Maduro actually publicly requested Colombia to join them in fighting the United States. Petro also said that he does not support a dictatorship and that Maduro is a dictator, but not a narco trafficker, and does support a negotiated peaceful solution between Venezuela and its people. Staying on the topic, during an interview, the Russian ambassador to Venezuela said that the military technical cooperation, which they have, they share a fair amount of military equipment there, continues, but Venezuela has not requested any additional military assistance or asked Russia to deploy weapons in its territory in response to the U.S. buildup. Over in Asia, an anonymous source working with Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi on devising Japanese national security policy told their media that I think we should possess nuclear weapons, quote and end quote. The source also acknowledged that that possession of nuclear weapons is currently unrealistic in Japan, but quoting again, in the end, we can only rely on ourselves. Now, this source does say that he's not currently involved in the revision of Japan's nuclear policy, so it doesn't look like there is push there. But at the very least, the highest levels of Japan, they are open to nuclearization. Then over in South Africa, we covered the raid that South Africa conducted on the refugee processing facility. The United States is now threatening severe consequences over that raid and the subsequent doxing of a U.S. official there. And they are calling for the South African government to bring the raid personnel to justice. And then just this morning, the Secretary of the Navy announced a new frigate class. It's going to be based on the U.S. Coast Guard's Legend class cutter, which just left production this summer. And it's projected to be in the water by 2028. So here about 2 years, probably less. The Navy intends to scale production, because obviously that's quite a bit of an issue, using multiple shipyards once the first one is complete. And I noticed that Secretary Phelan said that the frigate will be delivered on a wartime footing as well.
All right. Jared, this would be the first. We have 0 frigates in the water currently with the U.S. Navy.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
The Constellation is just not hitting it.
Okay. Any indication as to when the second one will roll out? So the first by 2028. That timeline is obviously subject to change. How long is it going to take the Navy to put enough frigates that we need in the water before a potential conflict with China?
Frankly, I don't know. When I say they announced it this morning, it was 1 hour ago. There's scant information on this, but I am very optimistic on this because the shipyard has already produced 10. It is already in production. And I think there's another shipyard producing as well. It's a known design. built in America here, and this administration cut off the last one that was made. They cut it off in June. So that to me looks like they probably are repurposing what's already there to get a jump start on the first frigate, which once they complete that design, it's easy to just go, hey, make this as well. I don't know. They did say they want to follow the Arleigh Burke's path, which there are quite a few shipyards that do produce that. We don't hit as many anymore, but at the very least, I think at one point we were doing. I'll double check, but I think at one point we were hitting 2 a year. We've produced a lot of Arleigh Burke destroyers.
All right. Thanks for that, Jared. Moving on, 321 protests this weekend, which sounds like a lot, and it's actually somewhat below baseline for a weekend. Pretty much all these protests are going to remain fairly low level until the spring, until it starts to warm up. All right, and then over here, Robert, let's go ahead and jump inside the Homeland operations brief. Columbus, Ohio, you say there's now a federal surge.
Yeah, this is according to local officials. They confirmed that there are ICE agents in Columbus, and they are conducting immigration enforcement operations. They did not say that they're aware of how many ICE agents are actually in Columbus. I did see some video footage taken by local activists that claim there are around 200 ICE agents that they have surveilled at a local hotel. The DHS, I've not seen yet. The DHS has formally announced this operation, but they've also not formally announced every one of these surges that I could find. There's also, according to a government contract document, the Trump administration is moving forward with a plan to build what they're calling detention mega centers. Basically, ICE is going to be buying warehouses and retrofitting them into detention centers to significantly expand the amount of beds that DHS and ICE have access to for immigration operations. And earlier this month or last month, a DHS official said on background that ICE would outright own these warehouses and staff them rather than doing contracts through local prisons or using military personnel to staff them. Looking at the contract document, I think this points to another indicator that the Trump administration is going to be ramping up immigration operations imminently. It was a no-bid contract when the dollar amount awarded was just slightly under the $30 million limit, where it would require a competitive bidding process. I think the point of this, and this is similar to the Boeing 737 purchase, and I think the point of this from the Trump administration is to minimize the amount of delays before getting these underway. Also, Chicago, some journalists in Chicago, Illinois, have said that all of the local Chicago media outlets, independent media outlets, and university newspapers are now working together to track or to build ICE and CBP tracking tools. They are also sharing information, which I think this is going to give the rapid response groups in Chicago that opposed Operation Midway Blitz previously a much stronger capacity to engage in coordinated disruption of CBP operations there, now that CBP official Greg Bovino is back in Chicago and they are ramping up operations again.
Yeah, I've noticed where Bovino has been very adamant that no politician, no mayor, no governor, no senator is going to have any impact on ICE operations, or ICE or Customs and Border Patrol immigration enforcement operations in cities like Chicago. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on to this alleged Antifa crackdown. By the way, before the Trump administration really got on the ball, there's an acquaintance of mine who's connected to the administration, and he said they are working on executive orders. They are going to go after Antifa. And I said that on the show, mentioned that in the report as well. And we have seen a couple of, I'll just say some fits and starts here. But this actually looks pretty significant if this goes through as what it sounds like, Robert.
Yeah, so this memo was originally leaked last week to a couple of different independent journalists. what's important about it is that it set a deadline yesterday for all federal law enforcement agencies to coordinate turning over all intelligence information they had on Antifa or Antifa related groups over to the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Forces. In this memo, Bondi also directed the JTTFs in a bunch of FBI divisions in the Criminal Justice Information Services National Threat Operations Center to investigate not just potential acts of domestic terrorism going forward, but also over the last 5 years. And this is going to include doxing law enforcement, coordinated interference with federal employees, which I think the implication is these attempts to disrupt the federal surges, and also any targeting of Supreme Court justices. I did see, so we covered that Turtle Island Liberation Front arrest on Monday. I saw that Stephen Miller said that he implied that this was a result of that National Security Presidential Memorandum 7, which outlined this Trump administration whole of government plan to target Antifa and some other far left groups. So I think this deadline passing yesterday to me I think we're going to see more of these arrests and targeted investigations of these groups like the Turtle Island Liberation Front in the coming weeks and months.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. All right, let's go ahead and turn now to this breakdown in consensus. This is something that is obvious to even casual observers, that the shared assumptions that underpin this post-1945, post-war consensus are breaking down. And you look at the United States and really more broadly the West coming out of this very costly but decisive victory in World War II, and they sought to institutionalize peace and stability around the world. So they embarked on an attempt to establish a system that we've come to know as the rules-based international order. And it's somewhat just looking at how that's breaking down. This whole concept of the rules-based international order is basically a meme at this point. I don't think it certainly doesn't exist today as it existed 10 years ago. But this post-war consensus underwrote political stability. It improved the likelihood of a peaceful conflict resolution, expanded access to global markets, and fostered economic growth, and created a high degree of strategic predictability. There was no question. If you look at a year or two from now, there's no question about who the major power in your area was going to be. And that's not so much the case now. 10 years from now, I think there still is a question about who is going to be the global hegemon and what regional power centers will remain in another 10 years, given what's about to happen. This next 10 years is going to be one of the most volatile, probably the most volatile of my lifetime, frankly. Nearly every part of this post-1945 order is either being actively contested or breaking down. We have these core pillars of this system on the international level. Really, there's two of them, and that is the United States as a global police force. And the second one, in terms of the West, as far as the West is concerned, is NATO as a unified, unquestioned security guarantor. And both of those core pillars are under duress, and their viability is in question. These two pillars were the global consensus a decade ago, and now both are breaking down. And this break in the consensus is one reason why the risk of interstate conflict is rising. I mean, you could say that is the breakdown in that consensus is the entire reason why Russia was able to, or why Russia decided to invade Ukraine. Certainly would not have happened if those two core pillars were viable and willing to enforce this global order. So today, as we look at the rules-based international order is being contested around the world, I want to really look at how elements of our national consensus are also breaking down. And this matters much more to you and me because history and a large body of conflict research show a strong correlation between a breakdown of shared consensus and the onset of political instability and civil unrest, and in some severe cases, organized political violence. We're talking about state breakdown and what we would call civil war or domestic conflict. There are 6 parts of this post-war American consensus that I believe to be the most important. You can find the details in this morning's report, which is available to early warning members, but I will go over them one by one. Number 1 is the American dream is achievable. That is breaking down. dollar primacy in this Bretton Woods global financial architecture that is being contested around the world. We're looking at de-dollarization, which has been, they say reports of the demise of the dollar has been greatly exaggerated, which is absolutely true. But we do see some competitors like China SIPS, the Asian Export-Import Banks, BRICS New Development Bank. We're talking about competing rails of this global financial system. The dollar's not going to be replaced. I don't think the dollar is going to zero. It's not going to disappear. It won't be replaced, but it will almost certainly be displaced, especially because the future strength and stability of the dollar is in question because of our rising national debt and worsening fiscal situation. So this is a breakdown in consensus that was virtually unquestioned less than 2 decades ago. The third is American identity as a creed, not a people. This is really probably the most important part of the post-war consensus as it pertains to the United States, because we have treated citizenship as a creedal proposition. And a lot of people have been talking about this concept of a creedal nation or a propositional nation. That means that anybody who believes in the American creed is a potential American, and they just need to get here and recite the creed. And according to Vivek Ramaswamy, they are as American as you or I. There is just as much American as a descendant of the Mayflower. That's what he said in an opinion piece just published a few days ago. But that is also in question now. 4 years of illegal mass immigration, and then today's fights over immigration policy and enforcement operations, and also fraud within the naturalization process, visas like H-1B, et cetera, are calling into question what constitutes legitimate membership in the American community. Is America a creedal country where anyone who cites the creed or believes in the Constitution and can get here, are they American? Or is America an actual nation of people with a shared ancestry and a shared heritage, language, culture, traditions? A decade ago, white Americans, for the most part, did not have any kind of racial identity or consciousness. And that is obviously changing, in no small part due to what they call the browning of America and these projections of whites becoming an eventual minority in a country their ancestors fought to establish and then build over centuries. I see this dispute predominantly on social media, but I do think the post-war consensus here that anyone can become an American is at least being questioned, if not being outright contested. The fourth is mass media as a trusted arbiter of truth. Something like 28% of Americans now say they have a great or fair amount of trust in the media. It's down from 72% just over 40 years ago, or almost 50 years ago. 34% of Americans say they have no trust at all in the media. And both those numbers are records going back to 1968. Technocratic governance and rule by experts, that's the fifth part of the post-war consensus that's breaking down. There's public skepticism towards government and social institutions. That skepticism is rising due to what's seen as the failures and corruption and ineptitude of the Mandarin expert class. We're talking about, I think, the bailouts of the Great Recession, Great Financial Crisis. I think that was probably the beginning, at least for me, the beginning of my skepticism towards technocratic governance and rule by experts. And then we have the once unquestionable science of the COVID pandemic response. That really damaged the credibility of America's institutions. But they weren't actually the most delegitimizing factors for the expert class. By far, the most delegitimizing factor remains the continual inability to hold accountable these elected and appointed officials for these dubious claims that they peddled and for this imposition of extraordinarily unnecessary policies during this whole COVID pandemic. This roughly 17-year period from 2008 to 2025, we witnessed probably irreparable harm to U.S. institutions. And this is very important because, by the way, there's a really great book, and like him, dislike him, it doesn't matter. Henry Kissinger. Niall Ferguson wrote a biography. He wrote at least the first volume of a biography on Henry Kissinger. And one of the most important parts in this book is where Kissinger is talking about how important institutions are to stable countries. And basically his argument is the most stable countries were the ones with the strongest institutions, because those strong institutions outlive any capable leader. And today that post-war consensus of strong institutions is breaking down exactly because they have become a source of instability rather than a source of stability. And then finally, number 6, this idea that capitalism is working for everyone. I do think that is a part of the post-war consensus that is breaking down. According to polling data from 2022 to this year, depending on which poll you look at, somewhere between 40 to 60% of Americans aged 18 to 29 say they hold favorable views of socialism. And there's ample reason to believe that socialism is in a period of political ascendancy, especially when we start to look at the effects of AI and what some people say will be a necessity for universal basic income, because there just won't be jobs. And depending on who you ask, Elon Musk just said, oh, the future is going to be wonderful. There's going to be so much abundance, you won't have to work. Maybe that will be true, but not before a very turbulent period in our near-term future before that happens, if that does happen. And frankly, I'm not sold. The other thing here, just looking ahead the next 10 years, the boomers have been a very moderating force on American politics. In less than 5 years, by 2030, all boomers will be above age 65. And so over the next 10 years, their power and influence, especially in support of capitalism and free market solutions, is going to be in terminal decline. And that's going to, that power and influence as a moderating force is going to reshape American politics, because that moderating force is going to be displaced by younger populist movements, specifically the populist left wing. And so that's a part of the post-war consensus, that capitalism is working for everyone. And I think that is under substantial pressure. And I bring these six factors up because I do think in many ways they're existential for the United States. When we look at a lot of the conflict research, we see these developments, this breakdown in the national consensus, or significant parts of the national consensus, does align closely with decades of conflict research in these conflict forecasting models. And there's a very good one. It was backed by CIA. It's called the Political Instability Task Force. I talked about it many times before. And when we look at these conflict models, what they're trying to do is look at current indicators and judge how close to conflict a country is. And they had something like an 80% accuracy rate. They were able to say a country was likely to break down into some form of domestic conflict, like domestic armed conflict, 2 years out. So we're talking about actual early warning here. And there's a handful of models, but I'll kind of key in here on this PITF one. All of these models show that elite factionalism, so that's a fracturing of the elite consensus, contested rules of governance, that's a fracturing of political consensus, extreme political polarization and social discohesion, that's a fracturing of the social consensus, declining legitimacy of government and institutions, that's a fracturing of the institutional consensus, and then finally declining legitimacy of the economic system, it's a fracturing of the economic consensus. Those are the primary drivers of state breakdown and civil conflict. And there's another really great book called Revolution and Rebellion in the Early Modern World. It's by Jack Goldstone. And he talks about the thing that he really keys in on. He calls it the structural demographic model. He talks about how demographic change is the single most important driver of state breakdown, which is notable considering the events of 2021 to 2025. And so these models in these studies use terms like elite defection, which you're going to hear a lot more about, elite defection and regime incoherence and legitimacy crisis and polarized identity competition. Those are these academic buzzwords, but they all explain the same underlying process of state breakdown. And this is when you get a collapse of shared rules and norms that previously regulated political competition and restrained the use of extrajudicial force. And I do think that also is breaking down. My conclusion from all this is that a worsening low-intensity conflict appears unavoidable. And just remember, low intensity people talk about civil war, and I'm not talking about 1861. I'm not talking about a high intensity conflict like World War II domestically or Russia-Ukraine domestically. That's obviously not going to happen, or very slim chance that happens. It's not impossible, I would say. But low intensity conflict is conflict beneath the threshold of conventional war. So we're not talking about high intensity conflicts, but it exists above routine peaceful competition. And the thing that I've said for the past 10 years is no one could say that the United States is at outright war with each other, but we're definitely not at peace with each other. So low intensity conflicts include things like violent social movements and terrorism, political warfare, guerrilla conflicts, popular revolutions to include color revolutions, all the way up to and including insurgency. And what I think is going to happen is that a worsening low intensity conflict is unavoidable because the breakdown in this national consensus is structural rather than incidental. The factors that are driving this breakdown are systemic. So they're affecting the elite consensus, political consensus, institutional, social, economic consensus. They're not caused by a single event or a single leader or a single policy choice. Regardless of whatever happens to Trump, the America First movement is already, that ball is already rolling. And I don't think it's going to be, that movement does not disappear regardless of what happens to Trump. So it's not like you can just remove Trump from the picture and all of a sudden this consensus is going to reemerge. That is simply not going to happen. So this is not a light or temporary policy disagreement. It's not going to be quickly reversed or easily fixed. And so I do think it's likely to continue producing greater conflict over time, really for two reasons. Number one is because these are zero sum breaks in consensus, meaning that for one side to win, the other side necessarily has to lose. And the second reason is because a lot of these are existential. If we want to avoid a conflict, I would say probably one of the best ways we could do that is to reestablish a shared national consensus. And we're talking about elite, political, social, institutional, economic consensus. So capitalism versus socialism. That is going to be the most effective way, maybe the only way, to avoid a worsening conflict. But because this breakdown of national consensus is zero-sum and existential, it is more likely than not that a new national consensus is not going to emerge until after we have some legitimacy crisis, like a constitutional crisis, or a period of internal conflict. I think it's far more likely than not that we will not reestablish a national consensus prior to having a conflict or prior to having some fight over it. And again, I'm not talking about 1861 or a war between the states or anything like that, but obviously we will have a worsening low intensity conflict through the rest of this decade, at least. Thanks for standing by on that. We do have some questions here. And Robert, this Brown shooter was on a diversity visa. So that's the visa lottery, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So basically anybody around the world can just apply for this visa lottery and they just get picked out of a hat, basically.
Basically, yeah, and then it puts them on the path to a green card. So the shooter did hold a green card, as far as I could find.
Okay, all right. And then this MIT nuclear scientist, was he also Portuguese?
Yes, he was, and they went to college together in Portugal. I looked through the charging document. There was no mention of motive, but apparently they did go to college together before they both moved here to the United States. And the shooter did attend Brown in 2001, 2002, and as a nuclear science graduate student, and then dropped out for unknown reasons and moved to Florida. But that's all I could see in the charging documents.
Okay, so we don't know why he killed this woman who was the president of the college Republicans or whatever she was there.
Correct.
Does that just look like wrong place, wrong time? I mean, was this? I mean, I know police haven't released a motivation, but
I will say that it's unusual for a mass shooter, like one that would target a school or college, to try to escape. I mean, that's what it initially appeared like. Normally, they will continue trying to kill people until the police show up, and then they get in a shootout with the police or they kill themselves. But this guy made an effort to escape. And was found, apparently did kill himself later on before the police found him, but there's no clear motivation yet.
All right. Very unfortunate. Thanks for that. Did you see the Angel Studios trailer for Animal Farm? It appears to be pro-communist and released on May Day. Well, Robert, I saw some coverage of it. I did not watch the trailer, but what I could gather it did seem like it had a bottom-up kind of populist left-wing revolutionary feel to it.
Well, I think the book also had that. So the author of Animal Farm, George Orwell, was a communist. He fought on the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War, and I think there's this misconception about the media that my perception of media is that the vast majority of people working for every studio, that includes Fox News, Angel Studios, are generally left-leaning or sympathetic to left-leaning ideas. So I this is not a surprise to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, just in terms of the message and the timing, being released on May Day of next year, I guess that's the release date. I'm not 100% positive on that, but it sure seems to be part of a larger strategic message.
Well, remember the Civil War, the A24 Civil War movie that came out. I think there are, maybe not coordinated, but there are definite messages coming out of Hollywood TV studios and stuff. And in that case, I think the original idea behind the Civil War movie was an anti-Trump polemic. And then when it looked like Trump was on track to win, they kind of rolled it back a little bit. But there are a lot of these polemics that come out, even if they're uncoordinated, that do contain a lot of political messaging in this line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially a movie like this, which is obviously targeting younger people. All right. Did you see Senator Mike Lee's Mark and Reprisal Reauthorization Act? Do you think it will pass? And will we make state-sanctioned piracy great again? I'll tell you, I'm somewhat doubtful, but Robert, what say you?
I also doubt it's going to pass. He's been talking about this for almost since the beginning of the year, I think. So I don't think it's likely.
Mm-hmm. All right. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard just acknowledged Islam to be the greatest threat to the United States and the world. President Trump has declared the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. Looking forward, do you expect to see more movement on removing these imams from the United States? Well, I think you have to look at what's going on around the world, but especially in Europe, and come to a similar conclusion here. It's one that apparently most European countries have not yet arrived at. Robert, did you see where Gabbard said this? I'm not saying she didn't say it. I'm just saying I didn't see it yet.
I haven't seen it either. Maybe this is an interpretation of the Afghan national comments. And I have seen that there are some states, there seems to be a picking up of these states, though, going after the Muslim Brotherhood and CARE. So now Texas and Florida, I'm keeping an eye on if any other states do something similar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in Texas here too, there's a group that's been trying to build this Islam exclusive community, and they'll have their madrasa and their mosque and all these things built out there. And it's really, it seems like it's extremely dangerous. Also pretty antithetical to even if America is only a creed, pretty antithetical to the creed as well. Do you expect to see more movement on removing these imams from the United States? So the Trump administration did say that they want to denaturalize between 100 and 200 naturalized citizens per month for denaturalization. And so do you think some of these imams who've been naturalized, do you think they would be targets here?
I think that's possible. The Trump administration started hinting at something like that after that Afghan national shot those 2 National Guard troops in D.C. So that they're probably in the target set.
Mm-hmm. All right. Regarding the federal surges so far, does it seem like these could have been test runs to evaluate the overall opposition response in order to craft the larger, later surges in a way that stays ahead of the tactics, techniques, and procedures that they think work so far? Robert?
I think that's possible, but since the first months of the surges, I I think the Trump administration was doing these surges specifically in Democrat-controlled states in order to get a lot of the legal fight out of the way and start creating these favorable legal precedents for deploying troops. And they've gotten some of that out of the circuit courts initially. Now we're still waiting on the Supreme Court to rule on the Chicago deployment. I think it's likely they will rule in the Trump administration's favor. And I think that was the strategy, was to get the most contentious fights out of the way to open the way for these larger surges later in the administration.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, it seems to me like these federal surges were not a test run. They were a run. Like that was the actual show. All right, Mike, in your opinion, what is an American? That's a great question. And I will just say this. You look at the founding, and you can even go back to the Declaration of Independence. And I think the founders were pretty clear on what they wanted and who they were doing that for. And the Declaration says, the Declaration of Independence says, for ourselves and our posterity. And then you can look at some of those, somewhat early American immigration and naturalization laws. And it was very clear. They did not intend to have mass hordes of the third world. Didn't exist back then. But, I don't think the founders would have been okay with bringing over, 10,000 Somalis into Boston or Baltimore or something like that. So I think it's pretty undeniable, at least in the very beginning of American history, the American people were meant to be a nation, people with a shared heritage and a shared ancestry. I mean, we're talking about Europeans here, and I have seen some quotes from the founders that say, "Oh yeah, we're willing to take anyone who believes in freedom," or something to that effect. I mean, like pretty vague quotes, and those are being used to try to promote mass immigration. Another reason why, not to get into a history lesson here, but put yourself back in that time period. The United States was a very young country. They're comparably far smaller than these European countries, and of course, they wanted immigration from European countries, and I think the intent there was to grow the country. We no longer need to grow the country. We don't need more people here. We do not need mass immigration here in the same way that the early American country did. And so, at any rate, my personal take here is I think America is a nation of shared ancestry and shared heritage and shared culture and certainly language. And I think the post-war consensus has successfully redefined that into this creedal proposition where we could potentially have 8 billion Americans if they all just said that they believed in liberty and justice for all and promised to be good Americans. Why? Let's just make the whole world American in that case. So, it does not make a lot of sense to me that America can be a propositional nation. And I'll tell you exactly why. There's a couple problems with this concept of the creedal nation. First of all, it's an oxymoron because a nation is a specific people with a shared ancestry and common heritage and traditions. So you would have to say creedal country. The problem with the creed is there's actually a couple problems with the creed. Number one is what is the creed? So Ben Shapiro and Vivek Ramaswamy, they talk about this American creed. What is it? What is specifically the creed? Is it going to bar Marxists? Is it going to bar Islamists? Who is it exactly going to bar from coming over here? Number one. Number two, I think the Trump administration has had a really difficult time, and I think they will continue to have a difficult time denaturalizing citizenship from immigrants who come here, are naturalized, and go on to commit crimes. So what is the enforcement mechanism? You bring someone over here in this creedal proposition, and they say, yeah, I promise to be a good American. I believe the creed. And what happens if that's not true? If we can't even strip naturalization or strip citizenship away from immigrants who come over here to commit crimes, and I'm not saying this is not a comment on how frequently crimes are committed. It is just saying there's obviously more than one who has come over here and committed a crime. if we have problems stripping citizenship away from that one person, the creedal proposition is basically unenforceable at that point. If you can't strip naturalization away from an immigrant who comes over here, is naturalized, and commits murder, you're certainly not going to do that when they come over here and they say, maybe they're not capitalists, maybe they're not pro-free markets, maybe they don't actually believe in liberty and justice for all. They just said that. So I think it's a very, very high bar to try to get them removed. And at that point, if I wrote this X post, and I probably should just read off this X post because it's no longer fresh in my mind. But at that point, if the creedal proposition is unenforceable, if you cannot strip citizenship away from people who violate the creed, then it's illegitimate. And if it's illegitimate, then it has no authority. So to me, right out of the gate, the propositional nation fails if it's unenforceable. And it appears to be because of the, and by the way, which Star Wars named federal judge is going to be the arbiter of whether an immigrant who has a naturalized citizen has violated that American creed? I mean, I just do not see how this is in any way forcible. So it's illegitimate and it carries no authority. And at the point where you have this propositional nation that is illegitimate and lacks authority, those are like the two of the prime factors on which society is based: things being legitimate and things having authority. So I butchered that response, but that's how I see it. What are y'all's initial opinion of the Cartel Mark and Reprisal Reauthorization Act? Will the federal government pay for the drugs that privateers capture? Asking for a friend. Well, Robert, you and I said, I don't actually think this is going to pass. But in theory, let's just say it did. What would this look like? All of a sudden now, someone with a boat and a couple of buddies and some firearms can go and hunt down drug traffickers in the Caribbean, or what?
Yeah, we could see something like a bounty program, hypothetically, or even like salvage rights. Like you capture one of these drug boats, you get to have it as property. I think that's something that would be historically aligned with this kind of policy.
Mm-hmm. All right, and then in this hypothetical, I can see all sorts of ways this could be abused, obviously. But in this hypothetical, let's say you go and recover $100,000 worth of cocaine that's being trafficked into the United States. You turn around and the federal government would basically buy that from you for street value, or what would happen? Or for some, maybe not street value, but they would give you some money for it.
Yeah, I imagine that's what it would be, is like the bounty for the actual narcotics they capture, and then they get to keep whatever non necessarily illicit, something like civil asset forfeiture, basically, which is what exists now for police departments. When they seize this stuff, they get some, I think they get some funding for the drugs when they turn them over to the federal government, but then they get to keep the assets they've seized.
Mm-hmm. All right. The Secretary of State announced they will be removing the NGO middleman to foreign countries, grants and loans. How effective do you think this will be in drying up the NGO networks? They are supposed to have trillions in assets. Well, I remember Ron Paul saying that American foreign aid is taking money from, basically giving rich people. Hang on one second. Sorry. He said, U.S. foreign aid is giving money to rich people in poor countries. That's basically what he said. And you look at these studies where it doesn't matter if we're sending them money, we're sending them food, we're sending them medicine, whatever. Most of the time, it is not making it down to the people that it's intended for. It's being intercepted by the government or by warlords, and it's being taken for their personal gain and not actually getting to the actual poor people that we're trying to help. So maybe removing this middleman, I'm not sure exactly how this would work. You have to have some kind of distribution agency. Most of the times you cannot trust the governments. You definitely cannot trust local power brokers. And I also haven't seen this announcement from the State Department. Have you, Robert?
Yeah, I think this was last week. I think we might have mentioned it. As far as how it will impact NGOs, definitely, they'll no longer be pass-throughs where they can basically skim some of the money off the top for their executives. And then as far as how it's going to be distributed, I think maybe the Trump administration's thinking about using U.S. military to do it, similar to like the Gaza thing that Biden did last year, where they built that distribution flotilla basically and had private contractors for security. Maybe we see something like that.
Sounds pretty costly. All right, if Democrats take back the House in the midterms, will the Trump administration be able to continue a full force deportation policy? It does not appear so. Robert, what say you?
Well, as long as the Republicans control the Senate, I don't think it'll have a huge impact on the surges. I could see them trying to tie Trump up in impeachment proceedings and stuff like that, and tying up some of his officials in hearings. But otherwise, I don't think it would actually have a huge impact on the federal surges and deportation operations.
Okay, so let's just get technical here. What about the rescission process? If the House controls the purse strings and they control the appropriations for these agencies, any kind of rescissions package that would have to pass the Senate is what you're saying?
Yeah, I believe that's how it would work, is they would have to get through the Senate, and any bills that the House proposed, even if the Senate passed it, I don't see a veto proof majority, so Trump could just veto any of these bills.
Mm-hmm. What about looking ahead towards the next continuing resolution, whenever that would be? Do you know when the next CR is up for a vote?
That's the end of January.
January
30th. And what I've seen so far is that a lot of the Democrats who forced the shutdown in October are backing off of threatening to force another shutdown in January. I think Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has come out and said that they want to avoid that, and I think Dick Durbin has as well.
All right. Hamtramck, Michigan City Council just voted to allow animal sacrifice for religious purposes, and New York is pushing for assisted suicide. I see both of these issues as evil. Do you see the federal government stepping in here as they are state-level issues? Well, I don't know. That's another question for Robert. Robert, I think animal sacrifice for religious purposes, that just does not scream American to me, frankly. Can the federal government do anything here, or would they?
I have to go back and refresh my memory, but there's some Supreme Court cases covering this. Specifically, had to do with Santeria practice, I think here in Florida. I don't think there's a mechanism necessarily for the Trump administration to reach down and stop any of this, because MAID isn't even new in the United States. I saw the New York announcement this week, but there have been some other states that do something similar. It's not quite as bad as Canada and parts of Northern Europe, where they are effectively expanding that to include people who wouldn't necessarily be terminally ill. So it's not quite that bad yet, but I do think that as time goes on, we will see more of these Democrat-controlled states start to adopt something similar to MAID, or medical assistance in dying. And depending on how the state-level healthcare costs, especially like Medicaid, the state-level Medicaid stuff that some states have started rolling back, as that gets more expensive, I think that's been the motivator for like Canada and Northern European countries to expand that. We could see some Democrat-controlled states start to expand MAID recommendations to more people than just terminally ill patients.
All right. Last question here. Beginning January 1st, people will begin feeling the full non-subsidized impact of Obamacare. And the family of four averages $1,800 to $2,500 per month. Heard anything about the impact of dollars going to insurance versus consumer spending? So the Trump administration did come out and say they had a plan, or at least a concept of a plan, where instead of doing these Obamacare subsidies, they would instead directly subsidize these healthcare plans for the families. And Robert, have you seen any movement on that?
I have not.
Okay. So as it stands, beginning January 1st, if you have an Obamacare plan, you're basically no longer receiving that subsidy, and you'll pay the full cost of that plan, which is, by the way, these plans are outrageous. All right. Let's just talk about maybe second or third order effects. This looks like to me that these people will not be able to afford their Obamacare plans, and they will stop paying for health insurance. I mean, effectively, that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, I think that's likely, just especially because they removed the the penalty that was a tax effectively for not having health insurance. I think that's the path of least resistance for most people.
Oh yeah, but if you're a family of four and you're paying $400 a month, I don't know what it is, but let's just say you're paying $400 a month for a health insurance plan for a family of four. There's no way you're going to be able to afford a $2,000 a month plan. You will not be able to afford it, and so these people will be losing health insurance. Correct?
I think that's likely. There were a couple of votes in the House and Senate on these on the subsidy extension that all failed over the last week. Now there is supposed to be a vote. There is a vote scheduled for January to basically do the Democrats' 3-year extension. I'm not sure if that's going to pass yet, but some Republicans have come out and said that there needs to be some kind of extension. There's just a fight right now whether it's over a 1-year or 3-year extension.
Mm-hmm. And just to remind everyone, this was supposed to be temporary. This is a COVID era temporary program that Democrats are trying to make permanent. You know, Robert, I'm just thinking about midterms, thinking about what the Trump administration, and I don't want to get into a policy debate here, but what the Trump administration can do to make these plans more affordable, not by subsidizing them, but by removing fraud, waste, and abuse, removing all of these very costly parts of the program that cause these health insurance companies to jack up rates every year. And listen, I was just looking at my health insurance plan, and the cost goes up every year because we get 1 year older every year. And in theory, you become more expensive as you age in terms of your requirement for medical care. But just crunching the numbers, we go to the doctor so infrequently. And I mean, we don't even meet our deductible here most years. So it just seems like this whole healthcare insurance is just completely broken. And obviously, the federal government subsidizing these plans is not the best solution. Is there any hope whatsoever? I mean, just look at how dysfunctional this Congress is. And what they could have done versus what they have done, they could have done a whole lot. What they have done is very little. Is the Trump administration, do they have any priority? Are they pushing Congress whatsoever to try to fix medical insurance programs in this country?
Well, a lot of the cost is because of the Obamacare requirement that they have, that they do not bar people with pre-existing conditions, the just increasing lifespan of Americans that do end up using a lot of, basically making a lot of healthcare visits. I think that's basically political third rail for everyone. And that's why even Republicans are not saying, are not actually looking at the reason why the insurance costs have soared, other than the subsidies. And they, just like with Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, all these programs that are set to start becoming insolvent in the next 10 years and are polluting the debt spending. I don't think there's any political will from anyone that has to get reelected or their party has to win elections in the future to do anything about that. So right now, I think the White House has just been behind the 1 year extension of the subsidies to get past the midterms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with the midterms being potentially existential here for the Trump administration. All right. Thanks for that, Robert and Jared. And we're all out of questions, everyone. That's going to do it for this Friday. It's going to do it for this week as well. We appreciate your support. And everyone have a great rest of your Friday, great weekend. We will be back in your inbox on Monday, back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.